From a collection of unmitigated pedantry, the blog of history professor Bret Devereaux. The Siege of Gondor, Part 6. Black Sails and Gleaming Banners. June 14th, 2019. This is the sixth and final part of a six-part series taking a military historian's look at the Siege of Gondor in Peter Jackson's adaptation of Return of the King. You can find the other parts linked here. This time, we are going to look at how the battle ends, contrasting the importance of cohesion and morale in Tolkien's narrative with Jackson's emphasis on weapons and weapons systems. But first, we've got to talk about some boats. Image: Umbar Corsairs fleet. Image description: Interesting, Tolkien is very clear the Corsairs' ships have oars. Aragorn has them row upriver. I find it a bit odd that Jackson has opted to make the Umbar Corsairs so distinctively different looking. Both strange ships, but also darker skin, black oily hair, etc. Umbar was another realm of the men of Numenor, and thus kindred to the men of Gondor. End of image description. As an aside, welcome new readers. If you enjoy this series, check out the resources links at the top of the main page to see some of my other writings. And if you want updates on my future projects, you can follow me on Twitter at Bret Devereaux or subscribe using this button. The Corsairs of Umbar. The films are quite vague as to how exactly the Corsairs fit into Sauron's overall strategy. Gandalf presents the Corsairs as simply one more cog in Sauron's war machine. Mercenaries from the coast, heading to Minas Tirith. Gandalf solemnly intones, quote, "Our enemy is ready, his full strength gathered," end quote. This is quite the departure from the books, where the speeding of events, the discovery of the ring, and the appearance of Aragorn have forced Sauron to act before he was ready, which is perhaps the only thing that saves the heroes. But he gives little sense of what they are for, though we see them sailing on front of what may be burning homesteads in the background. We see them again burning more towns from Aragorn's perspective as he leaves the paths of the dead. While the towns are burning, the ships are still sailing in the river. We don't see any ships docked or disembarking troops. So it seems that while the Corsairs are doing some raiding, they are mainly focused on getting to the main battle at Minas Tirith. Any broader strategic purpose is not made clear. Image: Umbar fleet and burning towns. Image description: These open grasslands are supposed to be some of the most densely populated farmlands of Gondor. Also, this fleet is much smaller than the one described in the books. I guess they spent the CGI budget on the elephants. As the Game of Thrones finale has shown, the correct choice. End of image description. Booknote: It is made clear in the books. When Aragorn and the Grey Company, along with the army of the dead, emerge from the paths of the dead, they find the local armies of Lamadan trying to hold the crossing at Linhir against a large force of Umbar and Haradrim soldiers. Return of the King, 166. We later find that these troops had disembarked from the main fleet, which had seized the port of Pelargir on the Anduin and remained anchored there, supporting a large Haradrim and Umbar force which was raiding deeper into Lebanon. Return of the King, 167. This fleet was not, in fact, moving to be part of the siege at Minas Tirith, at least not right away. Aragorn perceives that the siege had already begun, before the Grey Company even comes within sight of Pelargir, meaning that the Corsairs were making no effort to advance even at that late point. Return of the King, 166 to 167. This is because participating in the siege was not the point. Tying up Gondor's armies was. While in the films, pretty much all we see of Gondor is Minas Tirith, in the books, we are told enough to know that Gondor is a large country, and that gathering its armies for battle takes time. The purpose of the Umbar fleet was to create a threat to the south, which would prevent those forces from moving up to fight at Minas Tirith. At this, the fleet is initially successful, as the men of the city rue. Return of the King, 46. The Corsair fleet is also much larger. Legolas counts 50 great ships and countless smaller ones, and the Haradrim had a great army still, even after losing the initial exchange. Return of the King, 167. Dead men tell no tales. If you were hoping for one last logistics section, for old time's sake, I will have to disappoint. Sailing ships, like the one shown in the film, can manage incredible operational endurance because they can store a lot of cargo for each individual crewman or marine. And the Army of the Dead appears to require no food or water or baggage or roads, making it quite possibly the only army to ever have a logistics or operational mobility advantage over the Mongols. Image: Army of the Dead arriving at Minas Tirith. Image description: Army of the Dead sweeping into Minas Tirith. Given how far they go, it's clear that the men of Gondor never attacked out of the gate in the film, as they do in the books. End of image description. There's not much to do here, with either the capture of the ships or the arrival of the fleet to Minas Tirith. The Oathbreakers are able to move through solid objects sometimes, yet seem to be able to strike with their weapons as well. I suspect that the oddity of how this would look is why Jackson largely does not show the dead fighting up close. Instead, they tend to swarm in the background. Though they are also able to swarm down elephants in a way that suggests they can have mass when they want to. What I do want to note is that this sequence in particular loses track a bit of where things are on the battlefield. In particular, it makes little sense for Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli to be running past, on foot, the place where Éowyn is and Theoden fell. Keeping an eye on the map of the Pelennor above, you can track where the armies are coming from and likely to be. The Orc army arrives moving down the road from Osgiliath and encircles Minas Tirith. The main body of the army of the Haradrim is still on the road behind it, so to the east-northeast of it. Image: Map of the lands around Minas Tirith. Image description: Map of the Pelennor fields with the key routes shown. Aragorn's fleet docks at the Harland, the port of Minas Tirith on the Anduin. End of image description. The Rohirrim arrive through the Rammas at the northern end, thus striking the Orcish army on the flank. In the film, they seem to come from the east, with the rising sun at their back, and strike the Orcs in the rear, positioning which looks amazing, but makes little sense. The Rohirrim then turn to meet the Haradrim cavalry, presumably trying to catch them in the flank. Theoden falls relatively close to the city's gate. His body is retrieved by the men of the city while the battle is still ongoing. The films deviate a bit by having Theoden charge out to the Haradrim rather than the other way around, putting him even further east. But Aragorn and his fleet arrive at Harlan, which is at the far southwestern end of the battlefield. When he arrives at the port, we clearly see the Orcs there are not yet fighting, so the battle raging on the field is still well to the north of them. In the following scenes, the CGI team still knows where Aragorn is. The shots of Minas Tirith from his perspective always show its south face. You can tell because the spur of Mount Mindolin that dominates the center of the city faces east. But Jackson does not. For Aragorn to have crossed over Éowyn's path would require him to be somewhat to the northeast of the city, when he is shown to be well south of it. In the books, Aragorn does meet Éomer, who has recklessly charged south, while it is the Gondorian cavalry under Prince Imrahil which moves east along the road. By far, however, Jackson's biggest change is to bring the army of the dead to the city at all. Since none of the Orcs or Haradrim seem to be able to actually harm them, the dead serve as the ultimate trump card, rendering much of the rest of the battle apparently inconsequential. Had the Rohirrim not arrived, had Éowyn not defeated the Witch King, nevertheless, Aragorn would have arrived with his unstoppable army of the dead and won the battle. I've always assumed this change was to avoid the apparent, but not real, plot hole of why release the army of the dead after merely taking the fleet. But this just reintroduces the problem, lampshaded by Gimli at a later point. The question has the same answer in either case. Because it is the honorable thing to do, and Aragorn is an honorable man. This change also transforms the battle and its outcome in ways that become more obvious if we look at the same sequence through the eyes of the book. Logistics of the Grey Company. Book note. First, because this is me, we have to discuss logistics one last time. In the books, Aragorn's job is much more complex. The dead inflict supernatural terror on everyone, and very few can resist it. Gimli only barely manages. Return of the King 165-66. Bringing such an army to Minas Tirith might rout both friend and foe. In any case, the deal Aragorn strikes with the Oathbreakers covers clearing, quote, this land, end quote, Lebanon and Lemedon, of enemies, not all of Gondor. Return of the King 68. Moreover, since the purpose of the Corsairs was not to aid the siege, but to prevent aid from coming to the siege, if all Aragorn does is destroy the fleet, the Corsairs will have already accomplished their objective by preventing the men of Lemedon, Ethir, and Lebanon from coming to the aid of Minas Tirith. So, Aragorn must not only defeat the Corsairs, he must do it rapidly enough to load their ships with reinforcements and then reach Minas Tirith before the battle is lost. A tall order indeed. Aragorn's own force, the Grey Company, consists of himself, Gimli, Legolas, the sons of Elrond, and the Rangers of the North, is on horseback and moving over fairly familiar country. Aragorn departs the Black Stone of Erech on the morning of the 8th, arriving at Pelargir on the 13th, departing on the 14th, and arriving in Minas Tirith on the 15th, late in the day. Image, map of Gondor and surrounding lands. Image description. It can be hard to read, but Aragorn follows the dotted line from the Stone of Erech, upper left, through Lemedon, crosses the Ringlo, and then encounters the enemy at Linhir, before turning due east to head to the Pelargir. From there he rows up the river. This is the long route, and the country is rough. End of image description. The sailing time is more than reasonable, but the riding time is one of the few army movements that seems properly legendary, though it is carried out by a troop of legendary heroes and an army of tireless undead. The road from Erech to Pelargir is not straight and probably close to 300 miles. It is more than 200 as the crow flies. Aragorn has to make 60 miles or more per day in that ride. Gimli notes that it was exhausting, even for him. The Mongols sometimes manage that kind of pace, but the Dunedain are not Mongols. Still, with some allowance for this being a troop of legendary heroes, it is possible, if not likely, assuming they brought spare horses or acquired new ones as they went. One consequence, both of Aragorn's speed and the supernatural terror of his allies, is that the forces he meets initially cannot move with him. Aragorn first meets a Gondorian army trying to hold the fords at Linhir against the Haradrim. Rather than slowing down to incorporate them, he instructs their leader, Angbor, the local lord, to follow behind him, gathering what forces he could and moving overland to Minas Tirith. Return of the King 166. Given Aragorn's blistering pace, it's no wonder that he left this force behind. Angbor's cavalry catches up to Aragorn at Pelargir, but his infantry does not. Aragorn has Angbor gather that force while he takes the fleet, leaving Angbor to follow behind over land. Angbor's army becomes operationally important after this siege is over, because it allows Aragorn to pull much of the remaining forces defending Minas Tirith for his assault on the Black Gate, knowing that another army is drawing up behind him. End of booknote. Is the battle in our fields or in our heads? From a narrative perspective, what is more striking is how differently these decisions, between Tolkien and Jackson, frame the battle and its outcome. For Jackson, the Siege of Minas Tirith and the Battle of the Pelennor Fields is in many ways an alternating contest of tactics, machines, and weapons systems. Orcs towers, and catapults against men, walls, and different, better catapults. Like a game of rock, paper, scissors, orcs beat Minas Tirith, but the Rohirrim beat orcs, and elephants beat the Rohirrim before Aragorn finally cheats, calls out dynamite, which, as we all know from being kids, beats everything and wins the game. The Army of the Dead is simply a superior weapon system. This is a very modern and very mechanistic view of war, and I cannot say that there is no sense to it. Petaine's dictum, le feu tue, fire kills, uttered in response to French officers claiming before World War I that French élan would carry the field in the face of machine gun fire, has merit, especially in modern warfare, where the spirit of an army might mean little in the face of overwhelming firepower. At the same time, will in conflict still matters a great deal. We see this almost daily as overwhelming firepower fails to end conflicts with laughably under-equipped but remarkably determined foes. Tolkien's vision of war is more nuanced, shaped by personal experience. War machines matter, but chiefly as a means of degrading the will of the enemy. The great contest is not between engines or weapons, but between the dread of Mordor and the courage of men. Catapults, towers, and rams are merely the means that Mordor uses to deliver its terror. I have tried to flag instances of this in the book notes throughout this series, how close attention Tolkien pays to despair, dread, and fear on both sides. The power of the Witch King's catapults was that, quote, the valor of the city was beaten down, end quote. Return of the King, 108. But Jackson shows us not the despair of the soldiers, but the shattering of buildings. When the Rohirrim arrive, the key thing we are told is that, quote, the hosts of Mordor wailed and terror took them, end quote. Return of the King, 124. By contrast, Jackson opts to show us not the wailing of orcs, but the impact of horses. This same contrast comes out with Aragorn's arrival at the Harland with the black-sailed fleet. In the film, we see the ships pull up, unheralded and unannounced, and Aragorn's presence is only revealed at the very last minute. The decisive moment is Aragorn deploying his unstoppable superweapon, the Army of the Dead. What is relevant to Peter Jackson is the overwhelming lethality of these deathless soldiers. This is a touch ironic because in the books, even Legolas is unsure if the Army of the Dead can kill anyone, much less that they actually did. What he says is, quote, pale swords were drawn, but I know not whether their blades would still bite, for the dead no longer needed any weapon, but fear. End quote. Return of the King, 167 to 168. Instead, Aragorn's triumph is not about the killing power of the dead, but the courage of the living. Aragorn's ships, when he reaches the Harlan, are not filled with the dead, but living men, most of them former captives of the Corsairs, along with tired fighting men from Lebanon and Lamadon. His first task is to stir their courage and motivation, because he needs them to row through the night. The wind only changes in his favor in the morning, Return of the King, 168 to 69, to make it to the city. Then, Aragorn's arrival produces a series of sudden, rapid swings in the battle, which are all almost entirely dependent on morale. At first, the watchmen of the city catch sight of the fleet closing in and nearly panic, trying desperately and without success to call the army in the field back to the walls. Return of the King, 133. The armies of Mordor, on their last legs but a moment before, quote, were enheartened and filled with a new lust and fury, they came yelling to the onset, end quote. Return of the King, 134. Meanwhile, Éomer and the Rohirrim prepare for a desperate, doomed last stand, halting their assault and trying to form one last shield wall. At this point, the balance of men and weapons on the field has not changed at all. This sudden reversal comes only from the news. Battles often turn on such shifts in morale or sudden terrors. The Battle of Delium, 424 BC, between Athens and the Boeotians, provides one of the more dramatic examples. The Athenian right wing was initially victorious, smashing the Boeotian left. It looked as though Athens would carry the battle. But as the Athenians struggled to reform to sweep the Boeotian center, a relatively small Boeotian cavalry detachment, which had been hidden behind a hill, rode up. It was not so large a force the Athenians could not have defeated it, but the Athenian soldiers thought it a fresh army, not realizing it was just part of the army they were already fighting, and panicked. The victorious Athenian right disintegrated into a rout almost instantly, and Athens lost the battle on the very cusp of victory. Morale effects often outweigh physical ones. The weapon with which Aragorn again shifts the battle is one incapable of killing anyone: a flag. His banner unfurls, and instantly the battle shifts, as the forces of Mordor panic at the sight of new foes and the Free Peoples redouble their attack. Before the first man is disembarked from the ship, quote, "The hosts of Mordor were seized with bewilderment, and a black dread fell on them, knowing that the tides of fate had turned against them and their doom was at hand." End quote. Return of the King, 135. Even before Aragorn is able to disembark his ships, the forces of the city and the Rohirrim are sweeping east and south, carrying all before them. Aragorn's forces essentially arrive to mop up. Image: Aragorn's banner. Image description: Aragorn's banner from the Rankin Bass Return of the King, 1980, which is entirely omitted by Jackson, but very prominent in Tolkien's telling. It's odd to see Jackson miss such a good opportunity for visual storytelling. End of image description. The sudden shifting of emotions always recalls to me Thucydides' famous description of the naval battle in the great harbor of Syracuse, 413, between Athens and Syracuse. Wow, Athens really signed up for a beating this week. Both armies sat on the shore on opposite ends of the harbor, watching the fate of the campaign decided at sea. Thucydides describes the scene, quote, "Close to the scene of action, and not all looking at the same point at once, some saw their friends victorious and took courage, while others, who had their eyes turned upon those who were losing, wailed and cried aloud. And although spectators were more overcome than the actual combatants, there was every sound to be heard at once, shrieks, cheers, 'We win!' 'We lose!' and all the other manifold exclamations that a great host would necessarily utter in great peril." End quote. Thucydides, Book 7, Section 71, lines 3-4. That focus on morale gets to a truth about warfare. The winner of a battle is not the one that kills the most, but the one who makes the enemy run away. And the winner of a war is not the side which kills the most, but the side which can break the will of the enemy to fight. In the film, Gondor triumphs because Aragorn shows up with the Middle-earth equivalent of a weapon of mass destruction. They win by having the best weapons. But in Tolkien's universe, Gondor and Rohan triumph because their armies hold together even as the battle shifts around them. Indeed, at no point in the battle do the Free Peoples have superiority of arms. They are badly outnumbered from beginning to end. But they hold together against the fear and despair of battle, whereas the armies of Mordor, motivated only by the fear of their master, fall apart when things go wrong. In technical terms, the good guys remain more cohesive under the fears and pressures of battle. Cohesion in Tolkien. Booknote: Tolkien's view of cohesion is fascinating. Modern studies of unit cohesion tend to focus on the bonds between small groups of individual soldiers at ground level, as it were. This is the primary group, model of cohesion, first advanced by Marshall's Men Against Fire, 1947. Soldiers fight for the other soldiers in their unit. There is almost certainly a lot of historical contingency to this view. There is something to Ardent Depict's suggestion in Battle Studies, 1870, that the shift to shorter wars in the 1800s had fundamentally changed the nature of securing unit cohesion, what he calls the moral elements in battle. Tolkien reflects a much older tradition of unit cohesion. The unit coheres around the heroic leader. The decisive factor in maintaining cohesion in the armies of the free peoples are the conspicuous actions of their leaders. Of Gandalf and Minas Tirith, we are told, quote, "Wherever he came, men's hearts would lift again, and the winged shadows pass from memory. And yet, when they had gone, the shadows closed on men again, and their hearts went cold, and the valor of Gondor withered into ash." End quote. Return of the King, 107. Likewise, the critical moment for the Rohirrim before their charge is expressed as a crisis of leadership for Theoden. Quote, "Merry himself felt as if a great weight of horror and doubt had settled on him. Perhaps Theoden would quail, bow his old head, turn, slink away to hide in the hills." End quote. Return of the King, 123. Theoden does not quail, but instead, quote, "sprang suddenly erect, tall and proud he seemed again." End quote. Return of the King, 123. It is how Theoden seems which matters, because we are still seeing him in this scene with Merry's eyes, and thus the eyes of the Rohirrim, as he calls to his men, blows his horn, and leads the charge, ever before the knights of his house. Aragorn has the same effect. Gimli confesses that amidst the terror of the dead, quote, "I was held to the road only by the will of Aragorn." End quote. Return of the King, 165. Aragorn and the Dunedain, finding captives aboard the Corsairs' ships, quote, "bade them put aside fear and be free." End quote. Return of the King, 168. This model of cohesion, based on leadership, has its own historical tradition, but it is pre-modern, arising from literary accounts of war rather than theoretical military treatises, although the ancient world has those too, and this theory of cohesion appears in them. Ancient accounts of battles often focus sharply on the actions of commanders and pre-battle speeches. Good generals not only need good tactics, they have to give sharp speeches, call to their soldiers by name, and stir their courage through acts of personal valor. Somewhat ironically, one of the best examples of this paradigm in classical literature is the arch-villain, Catiline. See Sallust, Catiline, Book 57, Section 4, lines 4 to 61. A major part of this emphasis has to do with how the literature of the time was shaped, namely, that it was written for elites by elites. As a result, books on war and military aristocrats tended to find war was the best topic for books, second only to religion, emphasize the role of the commander above all. Partly, this was sensible teaching. The literate reader of a history by Thucydides or Sallust was more likely, by dint of his social status, to find himself in command than as a foot soldier. Even if the battle didn't depend on his sterling example of moral courage and leadership, it nevertheless behooved society to tell him it did, since that, after all, was his job. But there is also an element of discourse here. I am borrowing this framework from J.A. Lynn's Discourse, Reality and the Culture of Combat, 2005. Elites in societies tend to value the kind of fighting elites do, even if that sort of fighting may not be the sort that wins the battle. As a result, they create a discourse about that kind of fighting, or in this case, leading, which emphasizes their role. In pre-modern societies, where only the elites are literate, this can create a self-reinforcing feedback loop, where warfare comes to resemble the discourse as elites shape their own armies to better fit the mold of the books elites like themselves have written about war. The actual experience of the common soldier remained invisible, both at the time and to us, because the commoners could not write to write them down. Roman military literature is interesting in this regard, because every so often, the facade of elite discourse breaks, and it becomes increasingly clear that the leadership that held Roman armies together was not that of the elite aristocrat general, but instead the leadership of the experienced, but often decidedly non-elite, centurion, roughly the equivalent of a modern senior sergeant. Tolkien, of course, was enmeshed in this tradition by way of his academic speciality, as well as the classical focus that British schooling at the turn of the century had. But I think his viewpoint is also reflective of the view of the British, and especially the British middle and upper classes, of his day. British soldiers' memoirs from as late as the Second World War often emphasize the power of a cool and collected commander to improve unit cohesion and instill courage. Lindbergh has handily collected a number of examples you can listen to here. Listening to those memoir vignettes, it is worth remembering that Tolkien himself was one of those junior officers, a lieutenant in the Lancashire Fusiliers, perhaps being himself chastened not to duck. While a good part of his narrative borrows from the feats of legendary Anglo-Saxon heroes like Beowulf, it also borrows from his own war experience, as he indignantly reminds the reader in the preface to his second edition of Lord of the Rings, Fellowship of the Ring 11. Modern historians have often been dismissive about the impact of this kind of leadership, but I think these accounts should caution us. In a modern battlefield, all a soldier is likely to see is his unit, but pre-modern battlefields were much less spread out. It was possible to see if your king or general was brave or not. You might well be able to see his banner. Tolkien places a lot of importance on the king's banner among the Rohirrim, first Theodens and then Eomers. Interestingly, in late medieval Britain, the right to bear a banner, to be a knight banneret, was something confirmed by the king. Roman centurions wore a distinctive crest on their helmets for easy identification for much the same reason. One thing we can be quite sure of is that the ancient and medieval authors who write accounts replete with examples of personal leadership in battle is that these men were themselves almost all veterans of combat. Sallust and Thucydides, who I've mentioned, both commanded in war, though both unsuccessfully. Indeed, the very fact that this kind of discourse is created by military aristocrats talking to each other underlines the fact that it is military aristocrats doing the talking. As historians, we absolutely ought to question the framing of this discourse, but at the same time, we have to acknowledge that the authors we read likely know more about what battle was like before the advent of gunpowder than we do. End of booknote. Conclusions. And now, at last, we are to our ending. Elephants slain, orcs routed, kings returned. What have we learned? We've talked about logistics, sieges, cavalry, the physics of the battlefield, and the role of motivation and cohesion, among other things. Also, logistics. I worry that the temptation will be to reduce my analysis to book good, movie bad. But I actually think that Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings must stand as both one of the most difficult and one of the most successful adaptations in film history. Many of the film's shortcomings in portraying a sense of battlefield realism have more to do with the constraints of the medium. Film is an incredibly powerful medium, after all, but also a very limited one. Time is very limited, and everything in a film must be compressed. Given those limitations, Jackson's effort is nothing short of marvelous, even if it doesn't always capture the depth and nuance of the books. Peter Jackson lacks Tolkien's first-hand experience of war, but he cannot be said to have been insensitive to it. Just look at the craftsmanship and care that went into his They Shall Not Grow Old, 2018, which is now on streaming services, and go watch it. Instead, the note I want to end on is an awareness of the way popular culture, the discourse I mentioned above, shapes our views of wars, both past and present. When I teach that Lynn article, I find my students are readily able to accept that discourse has a deeply distorting effect on how people in the past viewed war, but somewhat slower to accept that they themselves are inextricably enmeshed in a discourse. Consider how many action movies or video games end with the enemy running away. In most video games, victory is had when the enemy is completely destroyed. Surrender or retreat is rarely an option for the AI. Yes, Total War and Paradox Studios fans, I see you. There are exceptions. Indeed, most popular culture shows battles being won by wiping the enemy out completely, usually with advanced firepower. Avengers Endgame comes to mind. Image: Aragorn after Battle of Minas Tirith. Image description: Aragorn, finding that the battle has run away from him. As with every other battle in Middle-earth, the fight ends not with total annihilation, but with the enemy running away. End of image description. But real wars are not won this way, and the failure to think about how to turn superior firepower into a way to break the will of the enemy has sat at the core of recent military failures. One thing Peter Jackson keeps from Tolkien is how the battles end. At the end of the Battle of Helm's Deep, the Uruk-hai are not slain to the last by the Rohirrim, they flee. At the end of the Siege of Gondor, we see the last elephants and orcs fleeing, as Aragorn realizes the battle has run past him. And at the end of the film, even as the ground collapses under them, we see armies of Mordor quail and then flee. Though one also wonders how much influence the common trope of the load-bearing boss has had on decapitation strategies. Image: Troll at the Battle of the Black Gate. Image description: I love this troll. He must be the smartest troll in all of Middle-earth. Everyone else is staring in wonderment, and he's already F this S-em out! Narrator voiceover: This troll went on to found a community of trolls called 4chan, which he and everyone else regretted for the remainder of his days. End of image description. As humans, we understand our society through past societies and war through past wars, simply because we can record the past but cannot see the future. But that memory, so important for our own decision-making, is transmitted primarily through popular culture. Popular culture is not bad, nor would an elite culture of the sort preserved from the pre-modern period necessarily be better. But it does distort our vision. I would hazard that for most folks, fantasy fiction like The Lord of the Rings remains the primary lens through which they interact with the pre-modern past. That alone makes it worthwhile to ask how much truth there is in these representations, and what that means. Image: Frodo saying it's done. Image description: But Mr. Frodo, what about Helm's Deep? F off, Sam. End of image description. And with that, my speechifying is done. Next week, something different. Subsequent edit. For those of you reaching the end of this series in 2020 or later, I did, in fact, write that companion series about the Battle of Helm's Deep in 8, yes, I know, parts. So, you've made it to the end of first Lord of the Rings military history. But what about second Lord of the Rings military history. And for those just joining now to finish out the Siege of Gondor series who want more looks at how popular culture shapes our view of the medieval past, might I recommend my 3-part treatment of Game of Thrones, How It Wasn't. You can start here. This has been a recording from a collection of Unmitigated Pedantry, the blog of history professor Bret Devereaux, recorded by myself, A Great Divorce, for accessibility and sharing purposes. If you enjoyed this content and wish to engage with it or support Bret, please check the description for links to the original post on his blog, his Twitter, and his Patreon. I highly encourage you to share, support, and engage with his works on any and all platforms, if you are so inclined. If you wish to support me, please do remember to like, share, and subscribe to this and any other content here that you enjoy. Thank you so much for listening.